Her judge ordered the grandmother to lose custody of her 7-year-old granddaughter for not having the means to raise her. But when the granddaughter asked to speak into the microphone, the judge was shocked. The aroma of freshly baked cookies hovered through the kitchen, illuminated by the soft afternoon light. Martha was arranging the last batch while Sophia, with her rosy cheeks and eyes sparkling with curiosity, waited impatiently by the counter. "Grandma, will these be better than last week's?" the girl asked, hands propped on her chin, already anticipating the sweet and buttery flavor. Martha smiled tenderly and replied, "Every batch is special, my little one. But I think these have a secret ingredient, the love you helped put into them." Sophia laughed, the kind of genuine laugh that melts any adult's heart. The house had always been full of laughter, since Martha moved in to live closer to her son and daughter-in-law. It was a cozy home, with large windows that let the sun in and shelves filled with children's books, often read by Martha during quiet evenings. The bedtime stories were a sacred ritual between her and Sophia. "You promise you'll tell 2 stories tonight?" Sophia would insist every night as she adjusted the pillows. "2 stories? Only if you promise to eat all your veggies tomorrow at dinner," Martha would respond playfully, but with a look that left no doubt the affection between them was unshakable. On that particular day, Sophia had spent the morning with her parents at the park. The swing, the fresh grass under her feet, and the distant sound of birds made the environment almost magical. When they returned home, Martha was already preparing dinner, something she made a point of doing whenever she could. "Mom, you don't have to do everything alone," her son said, grabbing a plate to help. "It's not work when you do it for those you love," Martha replied, putting a meatloaf in the oven. It was a phrase she often said, and every word carried the weight of her dedication to her family. Sophia loved those quiet afternoons when everyone was home. After dinner, Martha and the girl would sit on the living room rug, surrounded by board games and colored papers. "Let's draw a farm today, Grandma?" Sophia would suggest, already grabbing the colored pencils. Martha, with infinite patience, would help her granddaughter create drawings full of details, from chickens to fences. When they finished, they would hang their masterpieces on the kitchen mural, which was already filled with small pieces of childish art. "This will be our happiness mural," Martha would always say, proud of Sophia's creations. Later, as night began to fall, Sophia ran out into the backyard to play with the family's dog, a caramel Labrador. Martha watched her through the window, a cup of tea in her hands and a serene smile on her face. "She's so full of energy," her daughter-in-law commented as she approached her mother-in-law. "And full of love too," Martha replied, without taking her eyes off her granddaughter. The bond between them was undeniable, almost as if the grandmother saw in Sophia a second chance to live the childhood years she had always wanted to provide for her own son, but which, due to life's difficulties, she hadn't always been able to. When night came, the bedtime ritual began. Martha helped Sophia brush her teeth and put on her pajamas as the girl chattered away about everything she had done that day. "And tomorrow, Grandma, can we make those cookies with little chocolate chips?" "The ones Daddy likes?" Sophia asked as she snuggled under the covers. Martha laughed, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "Of course we can, but only if you promise to help me clean up the mess afterward." The girl nodded with so much energy that the covers almost flew off the bed. Martha sat on the edge of the bed and opened the book Sophia had chosen. It was a story they had read many times before, but it never failed to enchant. Martha's voice, soft and melodious, filled the room as the girl listened attentively, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. When the story ended, Sophia looked at her grandmother and asked with a sleepy tone, "You'll be here tomorrow, Grandma?" Martha smiled and kissed the girl's forehead. "I'll always be here, my dear, always." Those words were a comfort, a promise that seemed unbreakable. As Sophia slept peacefully, Martha went downstairs to the living room where her son and daughter-in-law were finishing watching a movie. "Did she finally conk out?" her son asked, smiling. "Yes, but not before asking for more cookies tomorrow," Martha replied, sitting down beside them. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and recollections of past moments. It was an ordinary night, but filled with love, the kind of night no one imagines will one day become just a memory. Sophia's last happy day with her parents was exactly that. Happy. The girl, surrounded by love and care, seemed to live in a world where nothing bad could happen. And for Martha, those moments were precious because she knew deep in her heart that life is made of small instants that should be cherished. Still, no one could predict that tomorrow would bring such drastic changes that would turn their lives upside down and call into question the promise Martha had made to her granddaughter. The day began like any other, with no signs that tragedy was lurking. Sophia was still sleeping soundly when her parents rushed out of the house for an important business meeting in another city. "Don't worry, Mum. We'll be back by late afternoon," Martha's son assured, adjusting his tie as his wife placed the last suitcase in the car's trunk. "Drive carefully," Martha responded, casting a worried look as she held the coffee she had prepared for them. They smiled, waved, and the car disappeared down the road. It was meant to be just another ordinary day. When the phone rang a few hours later, Martha was in the garden watering the flowers with Sophia, who was now running across the lawn with her dog. The shrill sound of the phone's ring seemed to cut through the air. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and answered. On the other end of the line, a formal yet grief-stricken voice sounded, "Are you Martha? I need you to come to the hospital immediately." Martha felt her body freeze. "What happened? Is it my son? My daughter-in-law?" She heard words that seemed distant, as if the world around was suddenly slowing down. "They were in an accident. It's serious." At the hospital, the corridors seemed endless, the walls closing in around her as she hurried toward the indicated room. The nurse hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry, ma'am. They didn't make it." For a moment, Martha was paralyzed. The weight of the words was crushing, as if the ground had vanished from beneath her feet. "No, this can't be true. They were fine. They were here this morning," she whispered, refusing to believe. Tears came uncontrollably, a deep wail that echoed through the void of loss. On the day of the funeral, the house felt full, yet empty at the same time. People came and went, offering condolences that sounded like distant echoes to Martha. She was seated in the living room, dressed in black, her eyes fixed on Sophia, who didn't fully understand what was happening. The girl held her grandmother's hand tightly, as if fearing Martha would disappear too. "Grandma, why aren't Daddy and Mummy here?" Sophia asked, her big eyes filled with tears. Martha swallowed hard, mustering a strength she didn't know she had. "They had to go away somewhere far, dear, but they'll always be watching over us." Rebecca, Sophia's aunt, arrived at the funeral midway through the ceremony. Tall and elegant, with clothes that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a moment of mourning, she walked among those present with a calculating gaze. She observed everything around her, mainly Martha, who was seated next to Sophia. Rebecca remained reserved, saying few words and fulfilling formalities. Despite her seemingly supportive tone, there was something in her gaze that Martha couldn't ignore. It was as if Rebecca were analyzing the situation, like a predator assessing its prey's vulnerability. The following days were a blur. Martha now had to deal with the weight of loss, but she knew she couldn't break down. Sophia needed her more than ever. On the first morning without her parents, Sophia woke up and ran to their room, only to find the bed empty. "Grandma, they haven't come back yet." Martha, trying to hold back tears, sat down next to her granddaughter and hugged her. "No, little one, but we'll be okay. I promise." Martha spent the rest of that day trying to keep Sophia occupied. They baked cookies, drew pictures, and even made up a new bedtime story together. However, when night fell, Sophia sobbed softly as she clutched her stuffed bear. Martha knew the adjustment would be long and painful. Rebecca began showing up more frequently, offering help that seemed more like an inspection. "It must be hard handling everything alone, Martha. Maybe Sophia should spend a few days with me." "I have space and can give her what she needs," Rebecca suggested on one visit. Martha, though tired and emotionally drained, responded firmly, "Sophia needs stability now, and that means staying here, at home, where she feels safe." Rebecca didn't insist, but the tension between them was palpable. As the weeks passed, Martha did everything she could to make Sophia feel some sense of normalcy again. She enrolled her in a music class, something the girl had always wanted to try. They walked together to school on the first few days, and Martha waited outside until Sophia waved from the classroom window. Sophia's drawings changed. Once vibrant and colorful, they were now darker, filled with gray clouds and figures that appeared to be crying. Martha noticed the emotional impact the loss was having on the girl, but never showed her own grief in front of her. Meanwhile, Rebecca seemed to be always lurking. In a conversation with one of the neighbors, Martha discovered that Rebecca had been asking questions about the family's financial situation. Deep down, Rebecca had well-defined plans. She learned of an inheritance left by Sophia's parents. The idea that a fortune was tied to Sophia's guardianship motivated her more and more. Her presence at the funeral wasn't just out of respect, but to assess how she could manipulate the situation. Rebecca knew that Martha was emotionally vulnerable and that over time she could use that to her advantage. In her private moments, she was already starting to devise strategies, planning each move to achieve her goals. Martha and Sophia's life went on, though each day was a struggle against sadness and longing. During the nights when Sophia finally fell asleep, Martha would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea, looking at the photo of her son and daughter-in-law that she kept in a frame. "I promised to take care of her. I promise she'll be happy," she would whisper to herself like a prayer. However, Rebecca's shadow continued to grow, and Martha knew something wasn't right. But at that moment, her priority was only to keep Sophia safe, even if the world seemed to be crumbling around them. The house was quiet, different from how it used to be, when laughter echoed through the rooms and lively conversations filled the air. Now Martha did her best to bring some joy back for Sophia. It was a challenging task, but she knew she had no choice. That morning, as she prepared pancakes, she watched her granddaughter sitting at the table, swinging her feet and looking absent-mindedly out the window. "Do you want to have maple syrup today, or do you prefer honey?" Martha asked in a cheery tone, trying to elicit a smile. Sophia looked up, forced a small smile, and murmured, "Honey, Grandma." Martha realized it would be a long road to restoring happiness to the girl. After breakfast, she tried to cheer Sophia up by suggesting a walk in the park. The leaves on the trees were already starting to fall, creating a beautiful yet melancholic scene that reflected the emotional state of them both. As Sophia played on the slide, Martha sat on a nearby bench, holding a bag with snacks. A group of mothers chatted further away, but Martha felt out of place, as if she now lived in a separate world where sadness was her constant companion. Even in the midst of difficulties, Martha tried to create special moments for Sophia. At night, she returned to the ritual of bedtime stories, holding the same book she read when Sophia's parents were still around. Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there was a princess who faced challenges to find her happiness. Martha began, with a soft and rhythmic voice. Sophia, hugging her stuffed bear, listened attentively. At the end of the story, the girl whispered, "Do you think Mommy and Daddy can hear me up there?" Martha felt a lump in her throat, but she answered firmly, "Yes, dear. They are always listening and cheering for us." While Martha dedicated all her time and energy to her granddaughter, Rebecca acted in the shadows. During a conversation with a family lawyer, Rebecca discussed the existence of an inheritance left by Sophia's parents. The amount was significant, enough to secure the girl's education and future. "The inheritance is tied to the child's custody," the lawyer explained, looking attentively at Rebecca. Behind her polite smile, she was already planning how to use this information to her advantage. The idea that Martha could control that fortune infuriated her. Rebecca began visiting Martha's house more frequently, always with a cordial smile and seemingly innocent questions. "How are things, Martha? Do you need any help with Sophia?" "I know it must be difficult for you to handle everything alone," she would say, while leaving a basket with perfectly arranged fruits on the table. Martha, ever polite, would offer tea, but her answers were brief. "We're fine, Rebecca." "Sophia is a strong girl, we're adjusting," she would respond, keeping a serene tone although she felt that something was wrong. She observed Rebecca's eyes, which wandered through the house as if searching for something specific. "Thank you for the visit, but we're managing," she would add, making it clear that she didn't need help. Rebecca, however, insisted, approaching Sophia with an affectionate demeanor. "How are you, dear? I hope your grandmother is taking good care of you," she would say in a sweet tone that sounded false to Martha. The girl would only nod shyly, feeling the discomfort in the air. Martha distrusted the sudden kindness, but for now she preferred to remain calm. Her focus was on protecting Sophia and ensuring that the girl felt at least a little normality in the new life they were building together. However, she knew she would need to stay vigilant. Rebecca had never shown interest before and was now strangely involved in their routines. Days passed slowly for Martha and Sophia, but Rebecca, ever calculating, saw this as an opportunity to advance her plans. Gradually, she began to appear more frequently, always bringing a convincing pretext. "I just came to see how you're doing," she would say, while her eyes scanned the house, analyzing every detail as if searching for something. Martha, though suspicious, maintained cordiality. After all, Sophia had already lost so much, and the least Martha could do was avoid further conflicts within the family. Rebecca took advantage of any opening to plant her traps. During one of these visits, she noticed that Sophia had tripped and scratched her knee while playing in the backyard. Quickly, she suggested, "Let me take care of that. I have a great cream in my car." Martha, who was busy preparing dinner at the time, didn't pay much attention. Rebecca fetched the cream, but instead of applying the product, she took a picture of the scratch with her phone, capturing Sophia's crying at the precise moment. "Poor thing, she must be suffering a lot," Rebecca muttered, but the tone of her voice had a coldness that Martha couldn't ignore. Days later, Rebecca appeared again, this time carrying a bag full of toys. "I thought I'd bring something to cheer Sophia up," she said with a broad smile. Sophia, innocent, was excited, but Martha continued to watch Rebecca cautiously. While Sophia played, Rebecca made sure to circulate through the house, pretending to be curious. Upon opening the kitchen cabinets, she casually asked, "Do you still keep all those old medicines of my brother?" "It's dangerous to keep things like that with a child in the house." Martha frowned, finding the observation strange, but before she could respond, Rebecca was already discreetly taking pictures of the bottles. Rebecca's trap began to close with a frightening precision. She manipulated everyday situations to make it seem like Sophia was at risk. One day, while Sophia was playing with paints in the backyard, Rebecca, with a concerned look, suggested that Martha go fetch water to clean up the mess. As soon as the grandmother left, Rebecca pushed a can of paint closer to the girl and took more pictures, as if Sophia were unattended amidst the chaos. It's so easy to set the perfect scene, Rebecca thought, satisfied with the progress of her plan. But it wasn't just in external situations that Rebecca acted. One day, during a visit, she purposefully dropped a small bottle of medicine on the living room floor, right where Sophia was playing with her building blocks. Later, when Martha found the bottle, Rebecca exclaimed, feigning shock, "Martha! I can't believe you leave something so dangerous within her reach." Sophia could have seriously hurt herself. Martha, confused, tried to defend herself, but Rebecca was already taking pictures to document the alleged negligence. Rebecca began taking these pieces of evidence to a social worker she knew, telling a distorted version of the facts. "I'm worried about my niece," Rebecca would say, with an expression of false sadness. "My mother is getting old, and I fear she doesn't have the ability to properly care for Sophia. Look, I took these pictures to show what's happening." The carefully selected images seemed to tell a story of neglect and imminent danger. Meanwhile, Martha remained unaware of the true extent of Rebecca's intentions. Despite her distrust, it never occurred to Martha that someone could use Sophia's innocence as a weapon. She was focused on maintaining a peaceful routine for her granddaughter, trying to compensate for her parents' absence. But the truth was that Rebecca was getting closer and closer to achieving her goals. Each photo, each subtle comment, each manipulation was part of a larger plan that Martha still couldn't see. One afternoon, Sophia came back inside the house after playing in the backyard, with small scratches on her arms, due to a branch that had fallen. Rebecca, always ready to distort reality, immediately grabbed the girl by the shoulders and asked loudly, "What happened to you? How did your grandmother let this happen?" Sophia, scared, tried to explain that it had been an accident, but Rebecca had already taken new photos. "This can't go on like this," said Rebecca, looking directly at Martha. "If you can't guarantee her safety, maybe it's time to think about other options." Martha, although furious with Rebecca's accusatory tone, didn't want to argue in front of Sophia and just took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. What Martha didn't know is that Rebecca already had everything she needed to take the next step in her plan. The photos were edited, the stories invented, and the social worker was convinced that something needed to be done. For Rebecca, everything was going exactly as planned, and for Martha the nightmare was about to begin. The morning started like so many others, with the aroma of pancakes wafting through the kitchen as Martha and Sophia shared quiet moments. "Grandma, can I put the strawberry syrup on today?" asked Sophia, already holding the jar with her little hands. Martha smiled and adjusted her glasses, taking the girl's plate. "Of course, dear, but be careful not to overdo it. You remember what happened last time, don't you?" Sophia laughed, an innocent laugh that seemed to light up the room. It was a morning like any other, or at least it seemed to be. The tranquility was interrupted by an unexpected and loud sound. 3 firm knocks echoed at the front door, making Martha jump. Who could that be at this hour? She muttered more to herself than to Sophia. When she opened the door, Martha's heart almost stopped at the sight of 2 police officers standing at the entrance. One of them held a folder full of papers, while the other carried a serious, impassive look. "Mrs. Martha, we need you to come with us," said the first one in a professional but cold tone. What's happening?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "We've received reports of mistreatment of your granddaughter, Sophia. We have a warrant to take her into custody while we investigate the allegations," explained the officer, already advancing into the house. Martha took a step back, shocked. "This is a mistake. I would never harm Sophia," she exclaimed. But the officers continued their work without showing any reaction to her words. Sophia, who had been watching from the kitchen, dropped her fork on her plate and ran to her grandmother. "Grandma, what's happening? Why are these men here?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. Before Martha could answer, one of the officers extended a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, please turn around. We're just doing our duty." The world seemed to crumble for Martha. She looked at Sophia, who had already started crying, and tried to explain, "Sweetheart, it's okay. I didn't do anything wrong. This is a mistake." But her voice faltered as tears welled up in her own eyes. "Please, there must be some mistake. I'm a grandmother who only wants what's best for my granddaughter," she insisted, but her words seemed to reach no one. When the click of the handcuffs sounded, Sophia screamed, "No, don't take my grandma. She didn't do anything." The little girl tried to run to Martha, but one of the officers gently held her back, keeping her away. "Sophia, it's going to be okay," Martha said, even though inside she was devastated. Her now bound hands trembled as she was escorted to the door. All she could do was look at Sophia, who was sobbing desperately, calling out to her. The pain of not being able to comfort her granddaughter was unbearable. At that moment, Rebecca appeared on the scene as if everything had been meticulously calculated. She showed up beside Sophia, wrapping the girl in an embrace that seemed protective, but her eyes hid a glint of satisfaction. "Sophia, sweetheart, I'm here. Don't worry, I'll take care of you," Rebecca said, stroking her niece's hair. Martha, still in shock, cast a glance at Rebecca, and something in her expression made her understand that none of this was a coincidence. But there was nothing she could do now. "Sophia, I love you. Remember that," Martha said before being placed in the patrol car. The door closed, muffling her granddaughter's screams echoing down the street. Martha felt the weight of tears streaming down her face, but held back her sobs, trying to remain strong for Sophia. "I need to prove this is a mistake. I need to get back to her," she thought, as the car slowly pulled away. At that moment, her only concern was how Sophia was coping with everything. For her part, Rebecca wasted no time in assuming her role as savior. Still holding Sophia, she spoke to the girl in a sweet but insidious tone. "I know this is difficult, sweetheart, but you're going to stay with me now. We'll get through this together." Sophia, her face wet with tears, simply nodded, unable to understand what was happening. Even in the confusion of her emotions, the little girl felt that something was wrong. "My grandma never hurt me. Why are they doing this to her?" she asked between sobs. "Sometimes things aren't as they seem," Rebecca responded, with a soft voice that concealed her true intention. She knew that every moment counted to solidify her position as Sophia's new guardian. As the patrol car disappeared into the distance, Rebecca looked in the direction it had gone, an almost imperceptible smile appearing on her lips. For her, this was just another step in her carefully crafted plan. Inside the police station, Martha sat on a hard chair, still trying to process what had happened. Her handcuffed hands rested on her lap, and the weight of injustice seemed to suffocate her. "I need a lawyer. I need someone to hear my story," she told one of the officers, but no one seemed interested in listening. The look from the people around her was one of judgment, as if she had already been condemned before even explaining herself. Meanwhile, Sophia remained at the house, now under Rebecca's care, who tried to appear welcoming. "I'll take care of everything now, Sophia, don't worry," Rebecca said, as she settled the girl on the couch with a cup of milk. But Sophia, even at her young age, felt that this was not her grandmother's secure embrace. In her heart, she knew that something terrible was happening, and that her grandmother's promise to protect her was being cruelly challenged. Sophia's hiccups echoed through the room as the social worker, a woman with a serious expression and firm gestures, held her by the hand. "Come on, dear, it's time for us to go," said the woman, but Sophia refused to take another step. "I don't want to go, I want to stay with my grandma," the girl screamed, with tears streaming freely down her face. She looked out the window, trying to catch sight of the vehicle where Martha had been taken, but it was already far away. Sophia's heart seemed to shatter with every second that passed away from her grandmother. Rebecca was beside her, pretending to console the girl. "Sophia, I'm here now. I'll take care of you," she said in a tone that sounded sweet but devoid of any real empathy. Sophia pulled her hand hard, trying to break free from the social worker while looking at Rebecca with suspicion. "I want my grandma. She didn't do anything wrong. Please don't take me away," Sophia pleaded, her voice laden with despair. The scene was devastating, but behind her facade of false concern, Rebecca seemed satisfied to see the plan unfold. On the other side of the city, Martha was sitting on a metal chair at the police station, her eyes downcast and her hands still trembling. The handcuffs had been removed, but the weight of humiliation was as oppressive as the cold metal on her wrists. "This is a mistake," she repeated, almost like a mantra. "I would never hurt my granddaughter. Please, someone needs to believe me." But no one seemed willing to listen to her. The officers rushed through the hallways, casting quick glances that mixed judgment and indifference. An officer approached with a stack of papers. "Mrs. Martha, there is an investigation underway, and you will remain in custody until a judicial decision is made. I recommend you seek a lawyer," he said, without looking directly at her. The words sounded cold, almost mechanical. Martha felt a wave of despair. Her priority was not to defend herself, but to protect Sophia. "And my granddaughter, where is she? She needs me," she insisted, but the officer merely replied, "She is being taken to a safe place." Meanwhile, Rebecca had already gotten what she wanted. With a calculated tone and the posture of someone playing the role of a heroine, she assured the social worker that Sophia would be in good hands. "I only want what's best for her," Rebecca said with an expression of false sincerity. The social worker, perhaps deluded by Rebecca's seemingly caring behavior, signed the papers for temporary custody without questioning. It was as if everything had been prepared to make Rebecca seem like the only solution. Sophia, on the other hand, felt completely lost. When she was finally put in the social worker's car, she turned to the window and screamed, hoping Martha could hear her wherever she was. "Grandma, I love you, I need you." But there was no answer. The girl hugged her stuffed bear tightly, the same one Martha had given her, as she sobbed silently. At the police station, Martha closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength. Even without hearing Sophia's screams, she knew her granddaughter was suffering as much as she was. "I won't give up," she murmured to herself, as a solitary tear rolled down her face. "I'll prove all of this is a lie. For you, Sophia, I'll fight." Meanwhile, in prison, Martha tried to cling to the small memories of Sophia to not lose hope. She thought of the happy moments they had shared, the cookie afternoons, the drawings on the kitchen mural, the bedtime stories. Each memory was like a thread that kept her connected to reality, a reminder that she needed to fight. "I need to get out of here. I need to prove I'm not guilty," she told herself, even though deep down she didn't know where to start. The loneliness was immense, but her love for Sophia was greater. Rebecca continued to move discreetly, reinforcing her position as Sophia's new guardian. She made visits to the family's lawyer, where she portrayed herself as a concerned and dedicated aunt. "I just want what's best for my niece," she said, in a tone that seemed sincere to those who didn't know her true intentions. Each step was calculated, each action meticulously planned to consolidate her control over the situation. Despite that, Something deep inside Sophia told her that things were not right. "Grandma always told me we should fight for what is right," the girl thought, even without knowing exactly how she could act. For now, all she could do was wait and keep the faith that Martha would find a way to come back to her. In the girl's heart, there was an unwavering certainty. Her grandmother's love was stronger than any of Rebecca's plans. The classroom, usually filled with children's laughter and lively conversations, was strangely silent that morning. Sophia sat at the back of the room, her shoulders hunched and her eyes fixed on the notebook, as if trying to disappear between the lines of paper. Mrs. Margaret, an attentive and dedicated teacher, immediately noticed that something was wrong. Sophia, who used to be one of the most participative and enthusiastic students, now seemed a faded reflection of the child she knew. "Good morning, Sophia," said the teacher, trying to cheer her up as she circulated around the room. Sophia looked up for a brief moment and mumbled, "Good morning," before turning her attention back to the notebook, scribbling something with little intention. Mrs. Margaret frowned, worried. She had always had a special fondness for Sophia, who brought a unique energy to class activities, but now that energy seemed to have disappeared. Later, during a free drawing activity, the teacher took the opportunity to observe the children more closely, especially Sophia. It was a simple and creative activity. The students could draw whatever they wanted. While the others chose happy themes like animals and parks, Sophia seemed immersed in a dark and lonely world. Her drawing was unlike anything Mrs. Margaret had ever seen before. There were bars filling most of the paper, with a small crying figure in the center. Above the figure, thick raindrops seemed to fall like tears from the sky. The teacher felt a knot in her stomach as she observed the drawing. She approached carefully and crouched down next to Sophia. "That's a very expressive drawing, Sophia," she said, trying to keep a soft tone. "Can you tell me what you're drawing?" Sophia hesitated, clutching the pencil tightly. For a few seconds it seemed like the girl wouldn't answer, but then she murmured, "It's just something I thought of." Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Mrs. Margaret decided not to press her at that moment, but something about Sophia's behavior troubled her deeply. During recess, while the children ran around the playground, the teacher took the girl's drawing and studied it again. The bars seemed to represent a prison, and the tears over the small figure were a clear reflection of suffering. Mrs. Margaret knew that Sophia had recently gone through a traumatic loss, but this seemed to be more than just sadness. There was something darker hidden in that art. Throughout the day, the teacher continued to observe Sophia. During classes, the girl avoided eye contact and rarely raised her hand to answer questions. When a classmate tried to talk to her, Sophia seemed to withdraw even further, as if she were afraid of saying something wrong. It was a behavior that Mrs. Margaret couldn't ignore. "I need to understand what's going on," she thought, as she wrote some notes in the class diary. At the end of the day, Mrs. Margaret decided to try a different approach. As Sophia was about to leave, the teacher gently called her over. "Sophia, could you stay with me for a minute? I'd like to talk to you." The girl stopped at the door and looked back, hesitant. After a few seconds, she nodded and walked back into the classroom. The teacher sat down beside her, trying to create a welcoming environment. "I've noticed you've been a little quiet lately. Is everything okay at home?" she asked carefully. Sophia averted her gaze and started playing with the hem of her shirt, a clear sign of discomfort. Like I told you, I miss her," she finally said, her voice choked. Mrs. Margaret felt her heart tighten. "I imagine it must be very difficult for you," she responded, keeping a gentle tone. "Do you want to tell me what's going on? I'm here to help." For a moment, it seemed like Sophia would open up, but then she quickly shook her head. "I can't talk. Auntie said I shouldn't." This response made the teacher understand that the situation was more serious than it seemed. Something was preventing Sophia from expressing her feelings, and that was not natural for a child. "It's okay, Sophia. You don't have to say anything now. I just want you to know that I'm here whenever you want to talk," Mrs. Margaret said, placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. Sophia just nodded and left in silence. Later, alone in the classroom, Mrs. Margaret looked at Sophia's drawing again. There was a deep sadness in that child, something that couldn't be ignored. The teacher knew she had to take action, but she also understood that she needed to be careful. Sophia was clearly afraid, and forcing her to speak could push her away even further. I need to find a way to help this girl, she thought, carefully putting the drawing in her folder. That night, Mrs. Margaret couldn't sleep well. The bars from Sophia's drawing seemed to haunt her mind. She knew she had to take some action, but she wanted to make sure Sophia felt safe. It was clear that the girl was going through something terrible, and the teacher felt an immense responsibility to be the support that Sophia needed at that difficult time. During recess, Sophia sat in an isolated corner of the schoolyard, hugging her knees and rocking gently, as if trying to find comfort in her own embrace. Mrs. Margaret observed from afar, her heart tight. This was not the same cheerful girl who had once filled the classroom with laughter and curiosity. Determined to help, the teacher took a deep breath and approached carefully, sitting beside Sophia in silence. "It's okay if you don't want to talk, Sophia," Mrs. Margaret began in a gentle voice, looking out at the empty schoolyard around them. "I just want you to know that I'm here. You don't have to be afraid of me." Sophia remained silent for a few moments, clutching her knees tighter, as if struggling against something within herself. The teacher waited patiently, sensing that the girl was on the verge of giving in to the pressure. Finally, Sophia raised her eyes, which were teary. "I miss my grandma so much," she whispered, almost inaudible. Mrs. Margaret leaned in slightly closer, keeping a calm and welcoming tone. "I know it must be very difficult for you," she said sincerely. "Your grandmother loves you very much, Sophia. Do you want to tell me what happened? Maybe I can help." The teacher's words seemed to open a door inside Sophia. The girl began to speak between tears, her voice trembling and full of emotion. "My grandma never hurt me. She always took care of me, always told me stories and made cookies with me. I don't understand why they did this to her," she said, her face red and wet from crying so much. Now my aunt said I can't see her. I asked so many times, but she said no." "Mrs." Margaret felt a mixture of sadness and indignation upon hearing Sophia's words. It was evident that something was very wrong, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. "Sophia, I believe you," she said firmly, while gently holding the girl's hand. "And I promise I'll help. But we need to do this carefully to make sure no one hurts you or tries to silence you. Do you trust me?" Sophia nodded slowly, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "I trust you," she murmured, looking into the teacher's eyes for the first time with a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Margaret knew that moment was crucial. Sophia had opened up to her, and now it was her responsibility to ensure the truth was revealed. After Sophia returned to the classroom, Mrs. Margaret began to think about the next steps. She knew she needed evidence to help Martha and protect Sophia. But above all, she knew she had to be discreet, because any wrong move could put the girl in even more danger. Determined, the teacher kept the drawing with the bars and tears that Sophia had made the day before, and began to take notes on the details the girl had told her. That night, Mrs. Margaret stayed up late, researching how she could report the situation without compromising Sophia's safety. She knew she would face many obstacles, but she also knew she couldn't abandon the girl. With a heavy heart but determined, she whispered to herself, "I will do whatever it takes to bring your grandmother back, Sophia. You deserve to be with those who truly love you." The relationship between Sophia and Mrs. Margaret became even closer in the days that followed. The girl, still traumatized by her grandmother's absence, began to see the teacher as a supportive figure. Whenever she could, Sophia would approach Mrs. Margaret, seeking comfort and security. The girl's behavior was different, even more quiet and introspective, but with small moments of openness when she was with the teacher. Mrs. Margaret knew there was much more to be revealed. One morning, while the children were doing a writing activity, Mrs. Margaret noticed that Sophia seemed uncomfortable, repeatedly touching her right arm as if it was sore. Intrigued, she walked over to the girl's desk and crouched down beside her. "Is everything okay, Sophia? Is your arm hurting?" she asked in a low tone so as not to draw the attention of the other students. Sophia hesitated, averting her gaze, but Mrs. Margaret noticed something alarming, a dark mark that looked like a bruise visible on the girl's delicate skin. The teacher's heart tightened. Trying not to frighten her, she continued, "Dear, if you're hurt, I can help. Do you feel comfortable telling me what happened?" Sophia, initially reluctant, looked at the teacher with teary eyes and finally whispered, "It was when I tripped." in the room. But there was something in her voice that wasn't convincing. Mrs. Margaret realized Sophia was hiding something, and her instinct told her it was directly related to Rebecca. Later, during recess, the teacher took another moment alone with Sophia to talk. "Sophia, I know it must be difficult to talk about some things, but I want you to know that I'm here to help you. No one can hurt you while I'm around," she said in a firm and welcoming tone. Sophia looked at the ground, holding her own hands tightly before beginning to speak. "I don't like staying at my aunt's house," she said, almost in a whisper. "She always locks me in the room when she goes out. She says it's so I don't get into trouble, but I get scared because I don't know when she'll be back." The confession took Mrs. Margaret by surprise, but she remained calm so as not to scare the girl. "Sophia, that's not right. You shouldn't be locked up anywhere ever. And about those bruises on your arm, did that happen while you were alone in the room?" Sophia shook her head, but her hesitation spoke for itself. "It was because I tried to get out when she locked me in. I was banging on the door and tripped. She got mad," Sophia said, her voice choking with emotion. Mrs. Margaret felt the gravity of the situation increase. It was clear that Sophia was not safe under Rebecca's care, and the evidence was starting to accumulate. The teacher gently held the girl's hand and promised, "Thank you for telling me, Sophia. I know it's difficult, but you were very brave. Now we'll find a way to help you and your grandmother. I promise you won't be alone." The days passed and the tension around Sophia seemed to increase. Rebecca, who had promised to actively participate in the girls' school life, began to miss school meetings without any explanation. Mrs. Margaret, who always tried to involve those responsible for the children's progress, realized that something was wrong. Rebecca should be here, she thought, while waiting for another scheduled meeting that ended up being cancelled. Sophia, in turn, seemed increasingly withdrawn, as if she carried a heavier burden than she should. One afternoon, while organizing the school files, Mrs. Margaret decided to investigate a little more about Rebecca. Using the little contact information available in the records, she sought information that could help better understand who was the aunt who now cared for Sophia. What she discovered left her alarmed. Rebecca had a worrying history of accumulated debts. There were records of lawsuits for default, unpaid loans, and even a recent foreclosure. This explained the negligent behavior and reinforced the teacher's suspicion that Rebecca might have financial motivations to keep Sophia under her custody. While at home, Sophia lived in an increasingly cold and oppressive environment. Rebecca, who initially tried to maintain the appearance of a caring aunt, now barely concealed her disdain for the situation. Sophia was constantly left alone in her room while Rebecca went out, claiming important things to take care of. One night, while playing with her teddy bear, Sophia overheard voices in the hallway. Rebecca was on the phone speaking to someone in a low but clearly irritated tone. "I know the real estate market is tough, but the house needs to be sold soon," Rebecca said, her voice laden with frustration. Sophia approached the door, listening intently. "The old woman left the whole house in the girl's name, but I'm in charge now. No one's going to contest that." There was a pause as Rebecca listened to the person on the phone. "Of course she doesn't know anything. She's a child. She doesn't even understand how these things work," Rebecca concluded with a cold laugh. Sophia retreated to her bed, feeling her heart pounding. The idea that her grandmother's house, the place where she had so many happy memories, could be sold without Martha's knowledge terrified her. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, hugging the bear tightly. The girl knew she needed to tell someone about this, but fear of Rebecca's reaction prevented her from acting immediately. The next day, Sophia arrived at school even quieter than usual. Mrs. Margaret, who was already alert to the situation, noticed a change in the girl's behavior. During recess, the teacher managed to get a moment alone with Sophia and gently asked, "Dear, are you all right? You seem troubled by something." Sophia hesitated, but the kindness in the teacher's eyes encouraged her to speak. "I heard my aunt talking on the phone yesterday," Sophia began in a low voice. "She wants to sell Grandma's house. She said no one will know because I'm just a child." Mrs. Margaret felt a chill upon hearing this. The idea that Rebecca might be trying to financially benefit at the expense of Sophia and Martha confirmed her worst suspicions. "Sophia, you were very brave to tell me this," the teacher said, trying to reassure her. I promise we'll sort this out, but we need to proceed very carefully to ensure your and your grandmother's safety. While Rebecca continued to miss meetings and avoid any involvement in Sophia's school life, Mrs. Margaret began formulating a plan. She knew she would need more evidence to confront the situation and ensure the girl's safety. Each conversation with Sophia revealed more pieces of this puzzle, and the teacher was determined to put them all together and seek help at the right moment. At home, Rebecca continued to act as if she were in control of everything. She spent hours on the phone negotiating and scheming, unaware that Sophia, with her childlike sensitivity, was observing and understanding more than she realized. But behind her apparent confidence, Rebecca was also starting to feel the pressure. Her debts wouldn't wait forever, and each day that passed without a financial solution seemed to inch her closer to a collapse. The tension between Rebecca's and Sophia's worlds escalated. While Rebecca saw Sophia as a key to solving her problems, the girl saw in the teacher a ray of hope amidst the darkness. Both knew something was about to change, but they were following opposite paths toward the same inevitable confrontation. The night was quiet at Rebecca's house. Sophia, alone in her room, couldn't sleep. The darkness seemed more oppressive than ever, and the distant sound of the television downstairs was the only thing breaking the silence. She hugged her teddy bear tightly, her thoughts swirling in her head. The words she had overheard Rebecca say on the phone wouldn't leave her mind. The house needs to be sold soon. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger with each passing day. Suddenly, she heard rapid footsteps coming up the stairs. Sophia quickly closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. Rebecca entered her room to grab something, muttering about an important email, and left without noticing she had left her phone on the desk. When the door closed again and Sophia heard the footsteps retreating, she slowly opened her eyes and saw the device there, its screen blinking. Sophia hesitated. Her heart started beating faster, but something inside her urged her to act. Carefully, she picked up the unlocked phone. On the screen there was a series of open messages in an app. Some words immediately caught her attention: inheritance, social worker, and plan. Even without fully understanding what she was reading, Sophia knew it was something important. She scrolled through the conversation, reading messages from Rebecca to someone whose name she didn't recognize. "I already have temporary custody," one message read. Another stated, "The house will be sold as soon as I sort out the signature issue. The kid won't know anything." And then the phrase that made Sophia's blood run cold: "The social worker is already on our side. She guarantees there won't be any legal complications." Sophia felt tears well up in her eyes, but she swallowed her sobs. She knew she needed to do something with this. Taking her hidden tablet from under the bed, she opened the camera and started recording the screen of her aunt's phone, going through the messages one by one. When she finished, she put the phone back where it was and took a deep breath. "Grandma needs to know about this," she thought, determined. For the first time in a long while, Sophia felt there might be a way to save her grandmother. The days in prison were becoming increasingly difficult for Martha. The environment was stifling, and the weight of the unjust accusations seemed to crush her more with each morning. The hours dragged on, and the only thing that kept her going was the love for Sophia and the hope that the truth would be revealed. Martha spent long moments sitting in a corner of the cell, with a lost gaze recalling the happy moments with her granddaughter. "I need to get out of here. Sophia needs me," she murmured to herself, as tears silently streamed down her face. The sensation of helplessness was cruel. Martha knew that her word was not enough to prove her innocence. The documents presented by Rebecca and the false planted evidence painted a distorted picture of her, and no one seemed willing to listen to her version. Her requests for contact with Sophia had been denied, which only increased her anguish. She must be so confused, so scared, she thought, squeezing her trembling hands. Martha felt as if she were withering away, not only physically but emotionally, with each day that passed away from her granddaughter. Meanwhile, at Rebecca's house, Sophia lived under constant surveillance. Rebecca was becoming increasingly controlling, realizing that the girl was quieter than usual. Sophia, on the other hand, hid a secret that made her feel a mixture of fear and determination. The tablet where she had recorded the incriminating messages was carefully hidden under the mattress of her bed. Every night, before going to sleep, Sophia checked to see if the device was still there, as if it were her greatest treasure. "This can help Grandma," she repeated to herself, as a way to remember why she was keeping those precious pieces of evidence. Rebecca, for her part, continued to advance with her plan. Determined to gain full control of Sophia's inheritance, she scheduled a final hearing to gain permanent custody of the girl. "After that, no one else will contest anything," Rebecca said on the phone as she organized the necessary documents. The tone of confidence in her voice hid the true motive behind her efforts. She knew that with permanent custody, she could sell Martha's house and access the money left by Sophia's parents without any impediment. For Sophia, the idea that Rebecca could make permanent decisions about her life was frightening. Every time she heard her aunt mention the hearing, she felt a knot in her stomach. What if she succeeds? What if I can never see my grandma again? These thoughts haunted her mind all the time. But despite her fear, Sophia knew she couldn't give up. The hidden tablet was her only hope, and she needed to find a way to use it in time. In prison, Martha continued to fight against despair, repeating to herself that the truth would come out. "Sophia is strong. She knows I would never do anything to hurt her. Something will change," she said, trying to cling to faith. However, with the hearing scheduled, time seemed to be running out for both of them. The silence at Rebecca's house was always heavy, but that afternoon it seemed almost unbearable for Sophia. Sitting on the bed, the girl clung tightly to her stuffed bear, her heart racing as she thought about the tablet hidden under the mattress. "It's the only evidence that can help Grandma," she told herself, like a mantra to remind herself of her mission. The fear of being discovered was constant, but Sophia had hope that no one would ever find the device. While Sophia was lost in her thoughts, Rebecca abruptly entered the room, as she often did. "Sophia, did you clean up this mess like I told you?" she asked, with an irritated tone. The girl shook her head in silence, avoiding eye contact. Rebecca looked around, clearly suspicious, and began rummaging through drawers and boxes. "You've been very quiet lately. Are you hiding something from me?" she asked with a penetrating gaze. Sophia remained motionless, trying to appear calm, but her heart was beating so loudly it seemed to echo in the room. Rebecca, as if she sensed something was wrong, continued to search the room. When she lifted the mattress, she found the hidden tablet. Sophia held her breath, feeling the ground crumble beneath her feet. Rebecca picked up the device with a triumphant smile. "And what do we have here?" she asked as she turned on the device. Sophia tried to hold back, but tears began to stream down her face. "Please don't touch that," she pleaded, her voice trembling. Rebecca raised an eyebrow, ignoring the girl's plea as she began to open the apps. "You really thought you could hide something from me?" she asked with a tone of contempt. She navigated through the tablet, but to her frustration, she didn't find the videos incriminating her plan. "Where are your evidence, Sophia?" she asked with a cold smile. Sophia didn't respond, just looked at the floor with silent tears. What Rebecca didn't know was that Sophia had sent the videos to the cloud using her school email. The girl had learned from her teacher how to use the feature and instinctively sent everything to a safe location, fearing this very moment. However, Rebecca was convinced that she had regained control. She set the tablet aside and approached Sophia, crouching down to be at the girl's level. "If I find out you've told anyone anything, you'll regret it," she threatened, her voice full of venom. "I can send you to a boarding school, a place far away, where you'll never see your grandmother again." Sophia looked at Rebecca with wide eyes, fear visible on her expression. "I didn't tell anyone anything," she mumbled, trying to hold back her tears. Rebecca narrowed her eyes, evaluating the girl's response, and then stood up. "Good, because you know what happens to children who can't keep quiet," she said, before leaving the room, taking the tablet with her. As soon as the door closed, Sophia collapsed on the bed, burying her face in the pillow as she cried softly. She knew Rebecca was willing to do anything to maintain her plan, but despite her fear, she felt relieved to have sent the videos to the cloud before they were deleted. "I did what Grandma would do," she thought, trying to console herself. "I'm not giving up." Meanwhile, Rebecca was downstairs examining the tablet once again. Her frustration grew as she realized there was nothing incriminating on the device. "This girl must be hiding something," she muttered to herself, still suspicious. However, in her arrogance, Rebecca did not imagine that Sophia had already taken a step ahead, ensuring that the evidence was protected. Sophia, lying on her bed, felt fear growing, but there was also a spark of determination within her. I need to tell the teacher, she decided, even knowing she could face consequences. Deep down, she knew the truth was the only thing that could save Martha and bring them back together. Despite Rebecca's threats, Sophia began to plan her next step. The next day, Sophia arrived at school with her shoulders more tense than usual. The events of the previous night still weighed on her, and the fear of Rebecca's threats made her heart race every time she thought of the confiscated tablet. But despite the terror, Sophia knew she needed to act. During recess, she approached Mrs. Margaret, who was sitting on a bench watching the children play. Sophia was holding her stuffed bear, something she rarely brought to school, and sat down next to the teacher in silence. Mrs. Margaret immediately noticed Sophia's nervousness. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, gently placing her hand on the girl's shoulder. Sophia hesitated, but after a moment of silence, she whispered, "My aunt found the tablet, but I managed to save the evidence in the cloud. I don't think she knows that." The words came out low but loaded with emotion. The teacher's eyes widened for a moment, surprised by Sophia's courage, but she soon smiled tenderly. "You were very clever, Sophia, very brave. And now we'll make sure that evidence stays safe," she said with a firm and reassuring tone. During lunchtime, Mrs. Margaret took Sophia to the principal's office, where there was a computer that could be used to access the cloud. Sophia was nervous, but the teacher's presence made her feel a little safer. "It's all right. We'll do this together," said Mrs. Margaret, as she helped the girl log in to the school's email. After a few minutes of searching, they found the saved videos. Rebecca's messages and the plans involving the inheritance were there, intact. "This is more than enough to help your grandmother," the teacher stated, her eyes fixed on the screen. She transferred the evidence to a secure device and ensured there were copies in different locations. "This evidence will make all the difference in court. Now we need to prepare for the hearing day." Sophia looked at the teacher, and for the first time in a long time she felt a little lighter. "Do you think this will save Grandma?" she asked, her eyes shining with hope. "I'm sure of it," Mrs. Margaret replied, squeezing Sophia's hand. With the evidence protected and the final hearing approaching, both knew that the next step would be decisive. The fight for the truth was just beginning. The tension increased with each passing day. With the evidence in hand, Mrs. Margaret knew she needed to act quickly. She spent the night reviewing Rebecca's messages, trying to organize everything in a way that would be clear to the court. The next day, as soon as she dropped Sophia off at school, the teacher went to the office of a local lawyer she knew from a community project. He was known for fighting for just causes, and above all for not being afraid to take on complicated cases. "I need your help," said Mrs. Margaret, as soon as she entered the office and placed the documents and videos on the lawyer's desk. "It's about a girl who is under the custody of a manipulative aunt. The grandmother, who raised her with love, is being unjustly accused of mistreatment. This evidence can change everything." The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a firm expression, picked up the tablet and began watching the videos and reading the messages. As the minutes passed, his expression grew more serious. "This is very serious," he said, finally leaning forward. "The messages and manipulations are clear. This Rebecca is not only exploiting the situation, but also putting the girl at risk. We'll act immediately." Meanwhile, Rebecca was beginning to realize that something wasn't going as planned. She noticed that Sophia was closer to Mrs. Margaret than ever, and that the girl seemed less apathetic, almost as if she were waiting for something. This aroused her suspicion. When she passed by the school on one of her occasional visits, she realized that the teacher was deliberately avoiding her. "She knows something," Rebecca thought, gritting her teeth. Determined to maintain control of the situation, Rebecca called her lawyer and insisted that the final hearing be brought forward. "I want to resolve this as soon as possible," she said urgently. "I don't want to give anyone time to interfere." As preparations for the final hearing were accelerated, news of the possible sentence reached Martha in prison. An officer called her to the visitor's room, where a legal representative appointed by the court informed her of the case's progress. "Mrs. Martha," the man began with a cold and direct tone, "if the accusations are confirmed, the sentence could be severe. We're talking years in prison for child abuse." Martha froze for a moment, feeling the weight of the words like a punch to the stomach. "But I didn't do anything. I never hurt my granddaughter," she exclaimed, her eyes filled with tears. "Why doesn't anyone believe me?" The representative continued, insensitive to Martha's despair. "With the evidence Rebecca presented, the case is against you. The only hope would be for new evidence to emerge to challenge what has been presented. Otherwise, the verdict will be inevitable." Martha brought her hands to her face, trying to contain the tears that wouldn't stop flowing. Her mind immediately turned to Sophia. "She must be so scared. She needs me," she murmured, almost to herself. Despite the pain, a glimmer of hope still burned in her heart. "Sophia knows the truth," she thought. "She'll find a way to help me." On the other side of the city, Rebecca continued to act hastily, determined to finalize the hearing before anyone could question her actions. "If I can get permanent custody, no one will dare to reopen the case," she said to herself as she reviewed the documents. She had no idea that Mrs. Margaret and Sophia were already preparing for the final showdown. What seemed to Rebecca to be a guaranteed victory was about to turn into a nightmare. At the lawyer's office, Mrs. Margaret and Sophia sat side by side as the lawyer reviewed the case. "We'll file this evidence immediately," he said. "This not only exposes Rebecca's true intentions, but also shows that the social worker was involved. We'll take this to the judge before the hearing." Sophia, though nervous, felt more confident with those words. "Do you think Grandma will be okay?" she asked, her voice low but full of hope. The lawyer smiled slightly. "With this evidence, we have a good chance. Now we just need to make sure everything is presented at the right moment." As Rebecca tried to speed up the process, unaware of the evidence against her, Sophia and Mrs. Margaret took the final steps to save Martha. The confrontation was near, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The night was especially quiet in Rebecca's house, but for Sophia, the calm environment brought no comfort. Lying in her bed, she pressed against her chest the only photo she still had of Martha. It was a simple image, taken in her grandmother's backyard, with the two of them smiling while holding a tray full of freshly baked cookies. Martha's look in the photo was full of love, and Sophia felt as if that smile embraced her, even from so far away. But on that night, not even the memory of that happy moment was enough to alleviate her fear. Sophia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the incessant thoughts about the next day's trial keeping her awake. What if no one believes the evidence? What if Grandma can never come home? She felt the weight of the world on her small shoulders, but something inside her, a flame of determination inherited from her grandmother, made her resist despair. Sophia knew she needed to be strong, even though she was terrified. As silent tears streamed down her face, she murmured to herself, "I promised Grandma I would help. I can't give up." Downstairs, Rebecca was in a completely different mood. Sitting in the living room armchair with a glass of wine in her hand, she smiled contentedly. The phone lay on the coffee table, its screen still lit after the last call. On the other end of the line, Rebecca's accomplice, the social worker, had just confirmed that everything was ready for the trial. "Don't worry," said the social worker, with a cold and professional tone. "My report is perfectly aligned with the accusations. The judge will accept it without questioning." Rebecca gave a short, confident laugh as she took another sip of wine. "Excellent. After tomorrow, all this will be over, and I'll finally be able to live in peace. This girl won't give me any more headaches, and the house and the money will be mine." She spoke loudly, as if celebrating with an invisible audience. The look of satisfaction on her face showed that she believed she had total control of the situation. Rebecca had no idea that the game was already starting to turn. Meanwhile, at the lawyer's office, Mrs. Margaret and her colleague worked tirelessly. The videos saved in the cloud by Sophia had been reviewed several times to ensure they were organized and ready to be presented in court. "These text messages are enough to completely discredit Rebecca," said the lawyer as he analyzed every detail. "Moreover, the social worker's participation will be exposed with this evidence. This could change everything." "Mrs." Margaret nodded, but the concern was still evident on her face. "What if the judge doesn't give us enough time to show this? What if Rebecca has more hidden tricks?" She knew that the system wasn't always fair, and that Martha was fighting against a scenario that already seemed predetermined. The lawyer, however, remained confident. "We have concrete evidence. Her case is stronger than Rebecca imagines. Now we just need to make sure everything is presented at the right moment." As they worked on the case, Sophia, in the silence of her room, finally fell asleep. But the rest was brief, interrupted by confused and anxiety-filled dreams. She dreamed that she was back at her grandmother's house, but every time she tried to reach Martha, something prevented her. She woke up suddenly with a pounding heart, hugging the photo she had in her hands even tighter. "I miss you so much, Grandma," she whispered, as she looked out the window and saw the city lights in the distance. Rebecca, still awake, was making the final adjustments to her own documents, while satisfaction continued to be etched on her face. "Tomorrow everything will be settled," she murmured to herself. To her, the trial was just a formality, a last step before finally securing possession of the house and the money. In Rebecca's mind, there was no room for failure. She saw herself as a winner, someone who had manipulated everything and everyone to achieve her goals. But what Rebecca didn't know was that Sophia, with Mrs. Margaret's help, had planted the seeds for her own downfall. The next day, the lawyer and the teacher would be ready to present the evidence and expose the truth. For them, it wasn't just a legal case. It was a battle for justice, for the love and family that Rebecca had tried to destroy. As the night deepened, the contrast between Rebecca's and Sophia's worlds became more evident. On one side, a greedy and confident woman, blind to the truth that was approaching. On the other, a scared but determined girl, holding her only memory of her grandmother and nurturing an unwavering faith that, in the end, love would prevail. The final battle was near, and the pieces were already in place. The next day, Martha and Sophia's fate would be decided. Sophia was sitting in the back seat of Mrs. Margaret's car, holding her teddy bear against her chest. The morning of the trial had finally arrived, and the girl's nervousness was visible. As she looked out the window, her mind was busy rehearsing what she would say to the judge. "I need to be clear, I need to tell everything. He has to believe me," she repeated in her mind, trying to find the right words. Mrs. Margaret, noticing Sophia's tense silence, looked in the rearview mirror and spoke softly. "Are you nervous, dear?" Sophia nodded her head, squeezing the bear tighter. "I'm afraid of saying something wrong," she confessed, her voice trembling. The teacher smiled tenderly and replied, "You are very brave, Sophia. All you need to do is tell the truth the way you already know it. Don't worry, I'll be there with you. I won't let you face this alone." Sophia sighed, but she was still restless. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the courtroom, the judge seated in his place and Rebecca watching from afar. In her mind, she repeated the words she had decided to say. "My grandma never hurt me. She always took care of me. It's my aunt who is lying." But fear still whispered that maybe no one would believe her. "What if they think I'm just a child who doesn't understand anything?" she thought, biting her lip. Mrs. Margaret, as if she knew what was going through the girl's head, gently held her hand. "Trust yourself, Sophia. Your grandmother would be so proud to see how hard you're fighting for her." Meanwhile, at another point in the city, Martha was being prepared for the transfer to court. The prisoner's uniform seemed to weigh more than ever, but there was something different in her gaze, a glimmer of determination. She still didn't know the details of the evidence Sophia and Mrs. Margaret had obtained, but she felt that something was about to change. As the guards led her to the vehicle, Martha looked up at the sky, as if seeking strength. "Just one more day," she murmured to herself. "Just one more day to prove my innocence." Inside the vehicle, Martha took a deep breath, mentally repeating the few words she intended to say. "I am not guilty. I have never hurt my granddaughter. I want her to know that." She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while she felt a small flicker of hope. Meanwhile, Sophia arrived at the courthouse, holding Mrs. Margaret's hand as they climbed the broad, imposing steps. Each step seemed heavier, but she kept going, remembering the stories her grandmother told about courage. "Be as strong as the heroes in the tales," Martha used to say. Now Sophia was the heroine, and the fate of her family depended on her. Before entering the courtroom, Mrs. Margaret crouched down to the girl's level and said, "Remember, you're not alone, and the truth always prevails, even if it takes time. Now, let's save your grandmother." The courtroom was filled with hushed murmurs when Martha was led inside, handcuffed, accompanied by 2 officers. Her figure seemed much frailer than anyone could imagine. The beige prison uniform hung loosely on her thin body, and her face, once so warm and full of life, now reflected the weight of weeks in prison. The handcuffs on her wrists seemed more of a psychological punishment than a physical one, and the silence that fell in the room upon seeing her enter was almost deafening. Sophia was seated in the front row, next to Mrs. Margaret and the lawyer. As soon as she saw her grandmother, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Grandma," she muttered, her voice muffled by sobs. Martha, upon noticing her granddaughter's presence, lifted her eyes, and her heart ached to see the girl's tear-stained face. She wanted to smile to reassure her, but she couldn't. Instead, she tried to convey strength with a look, as if to say, "I'm here, don't worry." However, the impact of seeing Sophia so vulnerable was almost unbearable. Rebecca, seated on the other side of the room, observed the scene with a carefully calculated expression. She displayed false concern, occasionally shaking her head as if indignant about the situation. Dressed in impeccable clothes and holding a handkerchief in her hand, Rebecca made sure to appear the figure of a caring and altruistic aunt. Every gesture was planned to convince the judge of her good intention. "It's regrettable that it has come to this," she whispered to her lawyer with a tone of false sadness. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and the atmosphere immediately became solemn. He was a man of serious appearance, with eyes that seemed to scrutinize every person in the room with precision. After taking his place, he adjusted his glasses and began to speak. "We are here to deliberate on the case of Sophia's custody and the charges against the defendant, Martha, for child abuse. I ask that everyone maintain order as we hear the testimonies and evaluate the evidence presented." The first to speak was the social worker's representative, who entered the room with a confident demeanor, holding a folder full of papers. He presented the prepared report, reading excerpts aloud. "According to our assessment, Sophia was found in an unstable environment where there were clear signs of neglect and danger. Dangerous medications were discovered within the child's reach, and reports indicate that the defendant had difficulty providing the necessary care." Each word felt like a stab for Martha, who clenched her fists as she listened to the accusations. Sophia, seated silently next to Mrs. Margaret, shook her head in denial. "That's not true," she muttered softly as tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Margaret held her hand, trying to convey reassurance. "Calm down, Sophia. The truth will come out." "Trust," she whispered to soothe her. The report continued with details that had been carefully manipulated by Rebecca and her accomplice. Furthermore, the representative went on, during family visits, witnesses reported behaviors indicating that Sophia was emotionally affected and under inadequate care. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, feigning an expression of deep concern. Even a handkerchief was raised to wipe away tears that never fell. It was a flawless performance. Rebecca's lawyer then asked to speak. He walked to the center of the room and began to reinforce the report. "Your Honor, we are talking about a child who unfortunately was exposed to harmful conditions, both physical and emotional. Rebecca, as a responsible aunt, intervened to ensure the girl's well-being. Her sole objective is to provide a stable and safe home for Sophia. Meanwhile, Martha remained motionless, but inside she was battling despair. She knew all those words were based on lies, but she was powerless to defend herself at that moment. Her gaze turned to Sophia, who seemed even more distraught. I need to be strong for her, she thought, taking a deep breath. On the defense side, Mrs. Margaret's lawyer observed every move made by Rebecca and her allies. He was waiting for the right moment to present the carefully gathered evidence. For now, he remained silent, knowing that letting the prosecution expose its weaknesses first would be a more effective strategy. When the report was concluded, the judge paused, adjusting his glasses once again. Thank you for the initial report. We will now hear from the interested parties and examine the evidence presented. I ask that you focus on the child and what is best for her well-being. At that moment, Rebecca clasped her hands in her lap and leaned forward slightly, as if ready for the next act of her performance. Sophia, however, looked at her with an expression of sadness and confusion. Despite everything, the girl knew the truth was on her side, even if it had not yet been heard. Behind the tears, there was a growing determination. She knew she needed to speak, and she knew the moment was approaching. While the judge organized the next stage of the hearing, the tension in the room was palpable. For Martha, for Sophia, and for Mrs. Margaret, this was only the beginning of a long battle that promised to reveal hidden truths and expose carefully constructed lies. And although the situation seemed bleak, there was a spark of hope that illuminated the way. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier and heavier. Martha, seated in her place, felt the humiliation increasing with every word uttered by the prosecution. The false report, the manipulated accusations, everything seemed like a perfect trap set to destroy her. Sophia, beside Mrs. Margaret, wiped away her tears as she looked at her grandmother. Every time she saw Martha's thin shoulders slumped in defeat, a knot formed in her chest. As much as she wanted to speak up, the fear of Rebecca still lingered over her like a shadow. The judge continued to listen to Rebecca's lawyer, who reinforced the aunt's sacrifice to protect Sophia. For Rebecca has dedicated her life to ensuring that Sophia has security and stability after the family tragedy, he said, with calculated gestures to appear sincere. She has done everything in her power to give the girl a better future. Rebecca, with her head bowed and a carefully rehearsed expression, pretended to be emotional, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Sophia clutched the stuffed bear she had brought with her, the same one Martha had given her years ago. It was as if the object carried the strength she needed at that moment. She knew time was running out. If she didn't speak up now, her grandmother could be convicted, and worse, she would be left forever in Rebecca's care. I can't let this happen, she thought, feeling her heart race. Taking a deep breath, she raised her small, trembling hand. I want to speak, she said, her voice hesitant but audible enough to silence the room. Everyone turned to look at Sophia. The judge, surprised, leaned forward slightly. You want to speak, Sophia? He asked with a serious but welcoming tone. Rebecca, however, stood up immediately, a look of panic masked by false concern. Your Honor, she's just a child. She's distraught by all this. I don't think it's appropriate to subject her to more pressure, Rebecca said, trying to interrupt. But the judge raised his hand, indicating she should sit down. If Sophia wants to speak, she has the right. This is about her, after all. Sophia looked at Rebecca, who shot her a threatening glance, but something in the judge's presence and Mrs. Margaret's silent support gave the girl the courage she needed. With trembling legs, she walked to the center of the room. The judge watched attentively, waiting for her to take her position. When Sophia finally turned to face him, holding the bear in one hand and wiping away tears with the other, she looked smaller than ever, but her voice came out clear. I want to tell what my grandmother did. Rebecca crossed her arms, visibly uncomfortable. Martha, who until then had seemed defeated, lifted her head, surprised and emotional to see her granddaughter there, gathering courage. The judge nodded, encouraging Sophia to continue. You can speak, Sophia, we're listening. The girl took a deep breath, clutching the bear tightly. What my grandmother did was give me so much love, all the love in the world, she said, her voice breaking but firm. A low murmur rippled through the room. Rebecca shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. She always took care of me. She baked cookies with me. She told me stories to help me sleep. When I was sad, she hugged me and said everything would be okay, Sophia continued, as tears streamed freely down her face. Martha couldn't hold back her tears as she heard Sophia's words. The girl's love, even amidst so much pain and fear, was undeniable. Sophia looked at the judge, her eyes brimming but determined. My grandmother never hurt me. She never did anything to put me in danger. But my aunt, she won't let me see my grandma. And she's not like my grandma. The judge frowned, clearly intrigued by what Sophia was revealing. Sophia, what do you mean by that? He asked gently. Sophia took another deep breath, mustering courage. I found things on my aunt's phone. I recorded it because I knew it was wrong, and my teacher helped me keep the evidence. Rebecca stood up again, now visibly furious. This is ridiculous. Your Honor, we can't trust a child to make accusations like this. She's being manipulated, she exclaimed. But the judge banged his gavel on the desk. Silence, Mrs. Rebecca. If Sophia has something to present, I want to see it. Sophia looked at Mrs. Margaret, who smiled and handed the lawyer the tablet with the saved videos and messages. The lawyer stood up, walked to the judge, and handed him the device. Your Honor, These are the proofs that contest the accusations against Martha and reveal Rebecca's true intentions, he said, as the judge began to review the content. The silence in the room was absolute as the judge watched the videos. Rebecca's messages about selling the house and manipulating the social worker were clear. Every word read and heard was like a blow to Rebecca's carefully constructed facade. Her face, once confident, was now pale and rigid. When the judge finished reviewing the evidence, he looked directly at Rebecca. "Do you want to explain this, Mrs. Rebecca?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. The social worker, sitting beside her, began to sweat, realizing her own involvement in the scheme would also be exposed. The judge turned to Sophia with a look of respect. "Sophia, you were very brave to bring this to light. Thank you for trusting in justice. Now we can move forward with the truth." Sophia returned to her seat beside Mrs. Margaret, exhausted but relieved. The weight she had been carrying seemed to have lessened. She looked at Martha, who now had a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The evidence had been presented, and the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The silence in the courtroom was almost palpable as the judge finalized his analysis of the messages on the tablet. Every word, every line of Rebecca's conversations revealed a well-architected but deeply cruel scheme. The intentions to sell Martha's house, control Sophia's inheritance, and manipulate the legal system with the help of the social worker were all there, clear and unquestionable. When he raised his gaze, his expression was one of pure discontentment. "Rebecca," the judge began in a tone that reverberated with authority and indignation, "the evidence presented clearly demonstrates that you manipulated this case from the beginning. The messages show that you acted out of financial interest, putting your niece in a vulnerable position for your own benefit." He paused, looking directly at Rebecca. "Do you have anything to say about this?" Rebecca, who until then had seemed petrified, finally found her voice but couldn't keep her calm. "This is an outrage," she shouted, rising abruptly from her chair. "Those messages were manipulated. I did all of this to protect Sophia. You don't understand the pressure I was under." Her voice was out of control, and the murmurs in the room began to grow as her calculated demeanor crumbled. The judge banged the gavel against the desk, calling for silence. "Sit down, Ms. Rebecca. Your actions here show no intention of protecting this child. On the contrary, everything indicates that you tried to exploit the situation for personal gain." Rebecca hesitated, but eventually sat down with a furious expression, knowing that she was losing control of the situation. Meanwhile, the social worker, seated next to Rebecca, began to sweat. Her face was pale, and she looked from side to side as if seeking an exit. When the defense attorney presented specific messages showing her involvement in the scheme, she could no longer maintain her composure. I didn't know it was that serious," she stammered, while accusatory glances came at her from all sides. "She convinced me it was for the girl's well-being. I just followed her instructions." The judge turned to the social worker, his expression even more severe. "You're telling me that you agreed to manipulate official reports without verifying the facts, putting a child's life and an innocent woman's reputation at risk? That is absolutely unacceptable." The social worker began to cry, raising her hands as if pleading. "I was pressured, Your Honor. She said it would be something simple, that no one would get hurt. I just did what she asked." Rebecca, realizing her accomplice's betrayal, stood up again. "Don't pin everything on me. You knew exactly what you were doing. It wasn't just my idea," she exclaimed, but her words sounded desperate, and the room filled with louder murmurs. The judge banged the gavel again, restoring order. "Enough. Rebecca, your actions are clear and you will be held accountable for them. As for the social worker, her conduct will be duly investigated and submitted to the proper authorities." He turned to the defense, visibly impressed. "Congratulations on bringing this truth to light. This court must always work for justice, especially when a child is at stake." As Rebecca and the social worker crumbled, Sophia looked at her grandmother. For the first time in weeks, Martha saw a glimmer of hope shine. The truth was finally being revealed. The silence that gripped the courtroom after the confessions and the revelation of evidence was almost deafening. Everyone seemed to be in a state of shock at the magnitude of what had been exposed. The judge, serious and stern, adjusted his glasses and banged the gavel on the desk, calling everyone's attention. In light of the evidence presented and the witness testimony, this court orders the immediate release of Martha. The charges against her are unfounded and based on criminal manipulations. Martha, who was still handcuffed on the defendant's bench, brought her hands to her face, trying to contain her tears. Her once hunched posture, weighed down by injustice, began to straighten slowly. She looked at Sophia, who was now smiling through her tears, feeling the same relief that was flooding her grandmother's heart. "I knew the truth would come out," Martha murmured, as one of the officers approached to remove the handcuffs from her wrists. Sophia couldn't wait another moment. As soon as the handcuffs were removed, the girl ran through the courtroom, ignoring protocol and curious looks. "Grandma," she cried, her voice full of emotion. Martha opened her arms and received her granddaughter in a tight embrace. The two cried together, needing no words. That hug was proof that even after so much pain, the love that united them was stronger than any adversity. Rebecca, on the other hand, was in complete panic. The judge's decision and the reactions in the room clearly indicated that her manipulation had come to an end. She looked around, desperately seeking a way out. Her mind worked quickly, but despair left her confused. Finally, in a sudden movement, Rebecca stood up from her chair and began walking towards the exit door, trying to appear calm. But when she realized that the officers were watching her every move, she decided to run. "Rebecca, stop right now," ordered the judge, but the woman ignored him. The room exploded in murmurs as Rebecca tried to open the courtroom door. Two officers quickly moved to stop her. "You can't arrest me. I didn't do anything," she screamed as the officers held her arms. Her attempted escape only reinforced her guilt in front of everyone. The social worker, who had confessed her involvement moments earlier, remained silent, huddled in her place, her face buried in her hands. She knew that any attempt to defend herself at that moment would be futile. The weight of her actions had finally fallen upon her, and there was no longer any way to escape the consequences. The judge banged the gavel again, ordering order in the courtroom. "Rebecca will be formally charged for her actions and transferred into custody. This court will not tolerate behaviors that put a child's well-being at risk and manipulate the judicial system. Officers, take her away." The officers began to escort Rebecca, who continued to scream and resist, but to no avail. Meanwhile, Martha and Sophia remained embraced, as if time around them had stopped. "I knew you would help me, Sophia." "I knew you were strong," said Martha, her voice broken by tears. "I promised I would help you, Grandma," Sophia replied, her eyes shining with pride and relief. Ms. Margaret, observing the scene, smiled emotionally. The teacher knew that this victory was not only legal, but also emotional. Seeing Sophia and Martha together again was the result for which everyone had fought. The courtroom began to slowly empty, but the impact of what had happened would continue to be felt for a long time. The mistakes that nearly destroyed a family had been exposed, and justice was finally starting to be served. As Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, Martha and Sophia left the courthouse hand in hand, feeling the warmth of the sun together for the first time in so long. As soon as Martha's handcuffs were removed, she looked at her wrists, marked by the week she had been unjustly detained. Her trembling hands could barely believe they were finally free. Martha looked around the courtroom, and for a moment, her eyes fixed on Sophia, who remained by her side, squeezing her hand tightly. The girl's tear-filled smile was the only thing that mattered at that moment. "We made it, my dear. We made it," Martha murmured as she embraced Sophia again. The judge, visibly shaken by the revelation of the evidence, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before addressing the courtroom. His posture, once rigid and imposing, now carried a weight of responsibility. "This court acknowledges that it made a grave mistake in accepting the charges against Martha without proper investigation. It is unforgivable that this situation has gone this far," he began, his voice grave but laced with sincerity. He turned to Martha, who was now standing beside Sophia. "Mrs. Martha, on behalf of this court, I offer my deepest apologies, not only for the injustice committed against you, but also for the impact it had on your granddaughter and your family." Martha, though still emotional, held her head up with dignity. "I just want my granddaughter safe, and the truth to be known," she responded, her voice firm despite the tears that still threatened to fall. The judge nodded. "The truth has been revealed today, and it will have its due consequences. This court will rectify the mistake, and you will be immediately released from all charges." Meanwhile, Rebecca, still in custody of the officers, continued to protest. "This is an outrage. This is all a setup against me. I did everything for Sophia's sake." Her words, however, fell on deaf ears. The judge did not seem willing to tolerate another minute of her lies. He turned to the officers. "Take her into custody. Rebecca will face formal charges of fraud, evidence tampering, and abuse of her position as Sophia's guardian. This court will ensure she answers for her actions." Rebecca, realizing there was no more escape, finally stopped resisting, but her face was contorted with anger and despair. She cast one last look at Martha and Sophia, as if still trying to intimidate them, but found only the resolute gaze of the grandmother and the newly discovered courage of the girl. Her attempt at control had come to an end. On the other side of the courtroom, the social worker was visibly shaken. She tried to avoid everyone's gaze, but she could not escape the judge's attention. He turned his attention to her, the tone of his voice laden with reproach. As for the social worker involved in this case, her conduct is a clear example of negligence and corruption in the performance of her duty. She will be formally suspended from her duties while this court investigates her involvement in the acts of manipulation committed by Mrs. Rebecca. The social worker began to stammer a response but was interrupted by the judge. "You had the opportunity to protect a child and chose to serve your own interests. The consequences of your actions will be severe." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and a sense of justice finally being served hung in the air. Sophia, still holding Martha's hand, looked up at her grandmother with a shy smile. "Grandma, now no one can separate us anymore, right?" she asked, her voice sweet but full of hope. Martha, holding back tears, replied, "No, my dear. Now no one will ever separate us again." The judge rose again, banging his gavel to restore silence. "Mrs. Martha, Sophia, I want you to know that this court is committed to rectifying the damage caused by this process. Not only by releasing you, but by ensuring that those responsible are punished within the law. Sophia, your courage today was essential for the truth to come out. You have every right to be proud of that." Sophia smiled, feeling for the first time that her voice had truly been heard. As the officers escorted Rebecca out of the courtroom, Sophia looked at her one last time. This time, there was no fear in her eyes, only relief. The woman who had caused so much suffering was now in a place where she could no longer harm them. The weight Sophia had been carrying had finally been lifted from her small shoulders. Martha, now more confident, thanked Mrs. Margaret and the lawyer who had fought for her and Sophia. "I don't know how I can repay everything you've done for us," she said, holding the teacher's hands. Mrs. Margaret shook her head, smiling. "Seeing you two together and happy is more than enough for me." As the courtroom began to empty, Martha knelt in front of Sophia and held the girl's face between her hands. "You were my light, Sophia. Even on the darkest days, I knew you would find a way to save everything we have." Sophia hugged her grandmother tightly, as if she never wanted to let go. Justice had been served, but above all, the love between Martha and Sophia had triumphed over all adversity. And in that moment, amidst the relief and tears, they both knew they were ready to start over. Martha and Sophia were outside the courthouse, under the gentle warmth of the sun that was beginning to break through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, there were no bars or walls separating grandmother and granddaughter. They were free together, and the nightmare finally seemed to be over. Martha bent down to Sophia's level and opened her arms, and the girl ran into the embrace, burying her face in her grandmother's chest. "I knew you would come back, Grandma," said Sophia amid tears. Her voice, still trembling, carried the purity of a love that not even pain and lies could erase. Martha held her granddaughter, as if her life depended on it, feeling the warmth of the small body that had been her greatest strength to survive that ordeal. "You were so brave, my dear, so strong. I will never forget what you did for us," she replied as the tears finally slid down her face. Beside her, Mrs. Margaret watched the scene with teary eyes. It was impossible to contain the emotion when witnessing that reunion. She knew how much they had both suffered and how arduous that struggle had been. Holding a handkerchief to dry her tears, the teacher whispered to herself, "It was worth it. Every moment was worth it." Martha looked at Mrs. Margaret, and still holding Sophia, extended her hand to her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice choked but full of gratitude. "You saved our family. Without you, I don't know what would have happened. Mrs." Margaret held Martha's hand firmly, smiling through her tears. "You did this together, Martha. Sophia is incredible, and that is a reflection of the love you have always given her." Sophia, still clinging to her grandmother, looked at the teacher and smiled. "Mrs. Margaret always said I wasn't alone," said the girl, with a voice that now sounded lighter, almost as if a new hope had been born. Martha stroked Sophia's hair, feeling stronger every second. "She was right. Now we're together again and nothing will separate us." The trio stood there for a few minutes, as if they needed to absorb that moment of freedom and relief. The sky seemed clearer, the air lighter, and the weight of the last few months seemed finally to have dissipated. For Sophia, this was the beginning of a new chapter alongside her grandmother. For Martha, it was proof that true love always finds a way to win, even in the most difficult circumstances. "Shall we go home, Grandma?" Sophia asked with a small but sincere smile. Martha nodded, her eyes still glistening with emotion. "Let's go, my love. Let's start over together." As they walked hand in hand, Mrs. Margaret followed them, feeling part of that family of heart. The nightmare was over, and the future, for the first time in a long time, seemed promising. The car stopped in front of Martha's house, and for a moment, both were silent, looking at the facade that no longer had the shine of other times. The curtains were closed, the plants in the garden were dry, and the air of abandonment seemed to reflect the months of chaos and suffering they had gone through. Martha took a deep breath, trying to contain the wave of emotion that overcame her. "We're home, my dear," she said, squeezing Sophia's hand, who was holding her inseparable teddy bear. Sophia looked at the house with a mixture of relief and sadness. "It looks so different, Grandma," she commented, as her eyes scanned every detail. The girl remembered how everything used to be clean and welcoming, a reflection of Martha's loving care. Now the marks of neglect and Rebecca's interference were everywhere. Martha smiled at her granddaughter with a reassuring look. "It's different, yes, but we'll fix everything. We'll bring our home back together," she said, opening the door with determination. Upon entering, the feeling of abandonment was even more evident. Misplaced furniture, accumulated dust, and open boxes were scattered throughout the rooms, remnants of the supposed investigation conducted by Rebecca to justify her actions. Martha ran her hand over the backrest of an old chair, feeling the dust on her fingertips. "She really had no limits," she murmured, more to herself, as she tried to hide her sadness from Sophia. But instead of letting themselves be discouraged, the two decided that this would be the first step toward a new beginning. Martha took off her coat and rolled up her sleeves. "Sophia, let's fix up this house together, one room at a time." "What do you think?" she asked with an encouraging smile. Sophia nodded, feeling a spark of enthusiasm. "I want to start with the kitchen, Grandma. That's where we made the cookies," she said, her eyes shining with a happy memory. Martha smiled, feeling her heart warm with her granddaughter's renewed energy. "Then the kitchen will be our first step." The two started with the kitchen, collecting the scattered utensils, cleaning the surfaces, and reorganizing everything in its place. Sophia was especially excited to find the old cookie cutter they used together. When she finally found it in a messy drawer, she held it up as if it were a trophy. "I found it, Grandma," she exclaimed, with a smile that lit up the room. Martha laughed, wiping away a stray tear. "I knew it was waiting for us," she responded, taking the cutter and placing it on the clean counter. As they worked, the sound of approaching voices caught their attention. Martha looked out the window and saw some neighbors standing on the sidewalk, watching with expressions of regret and shyness. Little by little, they approached the door. An older woman, who had been a friend of Martha's for years before drifting away during the confusion of the accusations, took a step forward. "Martha, I don't know what to say," she began, her voice hesitant. "I believed the things they said about you, and that was wrong. I'm sorry." Martha was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Finally, she smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The truth has come out, and that's what matters. Thank you for being here now," she responded sincerely. The woman, relieved, took Martha's hand. "Let us help. We don't want you to do everything alone," she said, looking at the other neighbors, who agreed enthusiastically. Soon the atmosphere came alive. The neighbors helped carry boxes, clean furniture, and even cut the grass in the garden. Sophia ran through the yard, excited to see things taking shape again. Martha watched it all, feeling a warmth in her heart that she hadn't experienced in months. With each room cleaned and organized, she felt a piece of her life falling back into place. When they finished, the sun was already starting to set and the house looked different. It wasn't perfect, but the chaos had been replaced by a sense of renewal and hope. Martha called Sophia into the living room, where they both sat on the finely tidied couch. "Grandma, our house is getting beautiful again," said Sophia, resting her head on her grandmother's shoulder. "It is, my dear, because now it has become our home again," Martha replied, stroking her granddaughter's hair. At the end of the day, when the neighbors said goodbye, Martha stood at the door, watching Sophia play in the yard with her teddy bear. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The nightmare was over, and there in that house they could finally start over. The next day, Martha was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The aroma of hot toast and freshly brewed coffee filled the room, bringing a sense of normalcy that seemed almost surreal after everything they had gone through. Sophia, sitting at the table, swung her feet absent-mindedly while drawing in a notebook. She seemed calmer than she had been in recent months, but Martha knew the emotional scars of trauma were still there. However, seeing her granddaughter smiling and peaceful again was all she needed to stay strong. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, surprised to find the lawyer who had represented the case in court. He was holding a folder of documents in his hands and had a serious but warm look. "Good morning, Mrs. Martha," he said, taking off his hat in a polite gesture. "May I come in? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Martha frowned, a little apprehensive, but let him in. "Of course, come in. Would you like a coffee?" she offered, trying to keep a casual tone, though she felt a slight nervousness growing in her chest. "No, thank you." "I won't take up too much of your time," he replied, sitting on the sofa and placing the folder on the coffee table. Sophia entered the room, curious, with her sketchbook in her hands. "Who is it, Grandma?" she asked, looking at the man. "It's the lawyer who helped us in court, dear," Martha replied, sitting next to him. "He came to talk about something important." Sophia, sensing the seriousness in her grandmother's tone, sat silently on a nearby chair, hugging the teddy bear she never let go of. The lawyer opened the folder, pulling out a thick envelope with documents. "Mrs. Martha, during the court proceedings, some financial information came to light that I believe you should know about. Most of this information was uncovered while we were investigating Rebecca's actions," he began, with a tone that mixed professionalism and empathy. "It involves the inheritance left by your son, Sophia's father." Martha felt her heart tighten. Just hearing her son's name was enough to bring back a flood of memories. "Inheritance? What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice faltering. She knew her son had always been responsible, but she never imagined he could have left something significant for Sophia. The lawyer continued, taking out more papers from the folder and placing them on the table. "Before the passing of your son and his wife, they had stipulated a trust fund in Sophia's name. This trust fund was legally registered and holds a substantial amount, intended exclusively for her future. However, Rebecca knew about the existence of this fund, and that was the true motivation behind her actions. She wanted control of Sophia's inheritance." Martha brought her hand to her mouth, trying to absorb what she had just heard. Her son had planned for his granddaughter's future in a way she could never have imagined. As tears began to stream down her face, she shook her head in disbelief. "He always thought of everything. Even with all the difficulties, he ensured that Sophia would have a secure future," she said, her voice choked up. The lawyer nodded. "Exactly. The trust fund was created to ensure that Sophia could have access to a quality education and that all her needs would be taken care of. The money was protected by strict clauses, but Rebecca tried to manipulate the system to assume Sophia's guardianship and, consequently, control of the fund. That was the reason for all the suffering you went through." Martha closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the pain and pride the revelation brought. She had always known her son was a big-hearted man, but discovering that he had thought so far ahead for Sophia's future deeply moved her. "He truly loved Sophia more than anything," she murmured, holding the papers with trembling hands. Sophia, who had remained silent until then, approached her grandmother and placed her little hand on hers. "Grandma, why are you crying?" she asked, concern in her eyes. Martha quickly wiped away the tears and smiled at her granddaughter. "They're tears of joy, my love. Your father thought of you in a very special way. He wanted you to have everything you need to grow and be happy." The girl looked at the papers, curious, but not fully understanding their meaning. "Does that mean we have money now?" she asked, with a child's typical innocence. The lawyer chuckled softly and replied, "It means you have a secured future, Sophia. Your father left this gift for you." Sophia looked at Martha, confused for a moment, but then smiled. "But I already have the greatest treasure in the world," she said, hugging her grandmother. "I have you, Grandma, and you're back." Her granddaughter's words touched Martha deeply. She held Sophia tightly, feeling that no amount of money in the world could surpass that moment. "You are my treasure, my dear. And now, with all of this resolved, we'll make sure your future is bright." "Oh, your father would be so proud of you," said Martha as she stroked the girl's hair. The lawyer, touched by the scene, began gathering the papers back into the folder. "Mrs. Martha, now that everything has been clarified, the trust fund will be under your control as Sophia's legal guardian. This means Rebecca will no longer have any power over you." He looked at Martha with an encouraging smile. "You're free to start over." Martha sighed, feeling lighter than ever. "Thank you truly for everything you've done for us," she said to the lawyer, who simply nodded, standing up to leave. "It was an honor to help you," he replied as he walked towards the door. "If you need anything else, I'll be available." After he left, Martha and Sophia remained in the room for a few moments in silence. They looked at each other, and then Sophia began to laugh, a sweet sound that filled the house with life again. "So, what are we going to do now, Grandma?" she asked, excited. Martha smiled, holding her granddaughter's hand. "Now we're going to live, Sophia. We're going to do everything your father dreamed for us and so much more." The two embraced again, and at that moment Martha felt that despite all they had been through, life still held a future full of hope and love for them. The night fell softly over the house, bringing a welcoming silence that had not been felt there for a long time. Sophia was sitting on the bed, already in her pajamas, hugging her inseparable teddy bear, while looking at Martha with a tired but happy smile. The room was tidy again, and the soft scent of the soap used to wash the sheets seemed to bring an air of rebirth to the environment. "Grandma, are you going to tell a story today? Like before?" Sophia asked, in a low voice, but full of expectation. Martha, who was finishing folding a blanket in the corner of the room, turned to her granddaughter with a warm smile. "Of course, my love. After all, we can't let our traditions get lost, can we?" she replied, sitting next to Sophia on the bed. The girl snuggled up quickly, laying her head on her grandmother's lap as she used to do before everything fell apart. Martha stroked her hair for a moment before starting to tell the story. "Once upon a time," Martha began, in that soft tone that made Sophia feel safe, "there was a very brave little girl and her grandmother who lived in a simple but loving little house. One day the girl's courage was tested by great challenges, but she never gave up. And you know what happened?" she asked, looking at Sophia, who was already half asleep but still listening. "Their love conquered everything," Martha finished, kissing her granddaughter's forehead. Sophia smiled, her eyes blinking sleepily. "That girl is me, isn't it, Grandma?" she asked softly, already starting to fully relax. Martha laughed softly, nodding. "Yes, my dear, that girl is you, my little hero," she replied, as she watched Sophia's eyes finally close. The girl sighed deeply, and for the first time in months fell asleep without fear, lulled by her grandmother's soft voice and the comfort of being home. A few minutes later, Martha carefully left the room, closing the door silently. As she went downstairs, she was greeted by a pleasant surprise. Mrs. Margaret was in the living room holding a cake covered in white frosting and decorated with sugar flowers. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I thought you deserved something sweet to celebrate this new phase," the teacher said, smiling warmly. Moved, Martha went to her and hugged her tightly. "You never interrupt, my friend. We owe so much to your dedication and courage for everything we have today. I don't know how I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done for us," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Mrs. Margaret laughed, shaking her head. Just seeing Sophia sleeping peacefully and you smiling again is already the best reward. The two sat at the kitchen table, cutting slices of cake as they discussed plans for the future. Now that things are finally getting settled, I think I can teach Sophia how to make those cookies she loves so much, Martha said with a sincere smile. Mrs. Margaret nodded. I'm sure she'll love that. And in time, all of this will just be a distant memory. The night ended with Martha watching Sophia sleep peacefully and the soft sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. The home was full of love again, and they both knew this was only the beginning of a better future. The courtroom was once again packed, but this time the atmosphere was one of justice being served. Rebecca, sitting in the defendant's bench, looked around with a desperate expression. Her days of manipulation and greed had come to an end. The judge, with a serious demeanor, pronounced the sentence, Rebecca, you have been found guilty of fraud, evidence tampering, and abuse of your position as Sophia's legal guardian. This court sentences you to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving 2/3 of your sentence. A murmur of approval echoed through the room. Rebecca lowered her head, with no more strength to argue. For Martha and Sophia, that moment symbolized the end of a nightmare. The social worker who had collaborated with Rebecca also faced her due consequences. After the investigations were concluded, she lost her job and was fined for misconduct and negligence in her duties. Your responsibility was to protect children, not allow them to be used as tools for personal gain, the judge declared sternly. The woman's pale face showed she knew this was the end of her career. The judge then turned to Martha in a softer and solemn tone. Mrs. Martha, this court acknowledges the grave mistake committed against you. On behalf of the judicial system, I apologize for all the suffering caused and order that compensation be paid to you for the time you were unjustly detained. Martha, emotional, nodded gratefully. Although no amount could erase what had happened, the apology and financial reparation symbolized the beginning of a new chapter. Justice had been served, and finally Martha and Sophia could start over with dignity. 6 months had passed since the day justice was finally served, and Martha's house was now a reflection of renewal and hope. The garden, once dry and forgotten, now bloomed with vibrant colors, while the freshly painted facade brought a sense of welcome. The home, which once seemed to crumble along with the events, now shone as a symbol of resilience. Sophia ran through the yard with her stuffed bear, but this time she didn't seem to cling to it for comfort or protection, but simply out of joy. The girl was more confident and happy. At school, she had returned to participating in classes with enthusiasm and making new friends. The trauma still left small echoes, but Martha's love and care helped her heal a little more each day. Martha, in turn, had not only regained her peace but also found a new purpose. Part of the compensation received had been allocated to a special project, the creation of a support group for families who, like hers, had been victims of injustice. The group, called Voices of Truth, was already helping other people find justice and hope. Martha, with her determination and experience, led the weekly meetings, sharing her story and encouraging others never to give up. Mrs. Margaret was a constant presence in the house. More than a friend, she had become part of the family. Martha, every time I see you and Sophia, I feel like I made the right choice in helping you, the teacher said during a visit as they drank tea in the kitchen. And I will never forget what you did for us, Martha replied, smiling. New beginnings had arisen, and the future seemed brighter than ever. The sun shone on Martha's blooming backyard, where a small party had been organized to celebrate a year since the end of the nightmare she and Sophia had faced. Tables decorated with flowers and a cake in the center gathered close friends and neighbors who, over that year, had become a true support network. Mrs. Margaret was among them, chatting and smiling as she looked at Sophia, who ran from one side to the other, full of energy. When everyone had settled, Sophia, now with a much more confident air and a radiant joy, climbed onto a small chair in the center of the backyard. With the teddy bear still in her hands, she looked at those present, but soon her eyes settled on Martha, who was sitting with a proud smile. "I want to say something," Sophia began, her voice clear and full of emotion. The group fell silent, attentive to the girl's words. "This last year was the best of my life because I have my grandma back," she said, her eyes shining. My grandmother always taught me that love is the strongest thing that exists, and she never gave up on me, even when it seemed that everything was against us. Sophia paused, holding back tears. It was her love that gave me the courage to face everything, and that's why I know that, with my grandma by my side, I can overcome anything. Tears streamed down Martha's face as she stood up and walked over to Sophia. My dear, you are the light of my life. I promise that from now on nothing will separate us again. I will be by your side, always. The two embraced, and emotion took hold of everyone present. At that moment it was clear. True love had won, and nothing could take it away from them again. If Martha and Sophia's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.